if you want to see pictures, but to emphasize this and emphasize the general, their general concepts of the specificity of minerals for a certain glandular activity. I thought that this would be of interest specifically to you people. And this he is going to do, and he is also going to talk to Bob Driver, because he says, he claims absolutely that he can handle leukemia through, that leukemia is a lack of a certain mineral. And he claims that he will personally see Bob Driver after or before or something and give him this. But I'm sure of what it is. It's that whole business of beets, which I have sent for, but which hasn't arrived yet.
Don't tell Dr. Winthrop.
No.
Well, don't tell anybody. Listen to what he's got to say.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, if I had what was bothering Bob Driver and somebody claimed that whole beet powder would fix it, I'd sure try it.
That's right, right.
There's no.
Can't hurt it.
It can't hurt. Nothing that this guy would give him would hurt. They're all food supplement things that are simply concentrated, you see. Grown in organic bases, etc., etc. But I thought that this would be of particular interest to you. And you see, he feels so precise about all this sort of thing, that this yeast that I gave Don, for instance, all this stuff is imported from Europe because there is no comparative product available here in the States.
Is he a source of supply for these things, you said?
Well, he is a source of supply for about 3 or 4 different products. That is all. The only stuff he supplies is stuff that he feels you can't buy in a health food store or the equivalent. And this is the only stuff he bothers with. So obviously the man is not merely out to make a lot of money or be in on this whole supplement deal, which he isn't. Anyhow, looks like we're all here now. This is the day that the Lord hath made, is what comes to mind. 5th hour, right?
Yeah.
This is the end of the 5th hour. In other words, at the end of today, you are through half of the work that you're going to do. Now, you're through half of the manipulative work that you're going to do. So we better see to it that we really understand what's going on the way. Now, as I indicated yesterday, when you get to the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th hour, you have a package in your hands which is the central core of what is going to be done here. The 1st and the 2nd and the 3rd hour, you have been preparing to get to this. But the 4th and the 5th and the 6th hour, you are doing your stuff. You are doing what you're going to do with that pelvis to get it organized, horizontal, the base of the floor of it, the stuff that keeps the stuffing in, balanced so that the stuffing stays in and doesn't sort of ooze out around the corners. And you see, this oozing out around the corners isn't such a bad metaphor at all, because you actually get this sort of deterioration of tone, which lets everything pound down on the base of the pelvis. And what are the commonest things for which males and females get into hospitals, even as of today, if I'm not mistaken? Somebody's got to take the uterus of the female out, and somebody's got to doctor up the prostate in the man. Because there's been no support. And support is not a solid thing underneath. If you want to have some fun thinking, you get back in a corner and realize the change in the ideas of support that have come in the last 75 years since the turn of the century. When I was young, the symbol of support was the Rock of Gibraltar. It was as firm as the Rock of Gibraltar. And then an insurance company used as its symbol the Rock of Gibraltar. And a bank used as its symbol a pyramid or an Egyptian temple or something of this sort. This was support in those days. This was solidity. This was something you could rely on. But this is not what you can put the contents of a pelvis on. It's no good for that. It's not much good for banks. Those of you that lived through 1907 knew that too. So that the whole idea of support has changed. Nowadays, our banks are secure, in quotes, when you put them into glass so that you can see the farthest corner of them any hour of the day or night. It's an interesting change. And you see, this is reflecting in another department of life that whole change that came in around the turn of the century when we began to understand relationship. And now that which is secure is that which is in a secure relationship. That you're a hammock that you're of energy that you're not going to fall out of. Something that is supported by imaginary lines. But apparently this gives you support, providing the lines are where the lines belong. Now as soon as you break down the place of where the lines belong, your support breaks down. And you see, we haven't gotten that far away from this old idea of support yet. We sit around and we talk, and we philosophize about this newer type of support. But the number of people that live on the face of the earth who really mentally live in this idea are few and far between. They talk about it. Now this is where your problem lies, to jack yourself up into the level where this type of support is real, and to drag with you a varying number of other people so that they can, quote, share your heaven. And so you see, that floor of the pelvis now becomes an outward and visible indication of how these lines of force are balancing. Where's Sharon? Oh, there she is. And you all realize why I was thinking of her. Now it is interesting that it's interesting to see how to me it's interesting to see how ideas develop. You take in mental and religious ideas, for example. It's now just about 100 years since the whole episode of American metaphysics opened its eyes back in New York State and Vermont and so forth and so forth. And out of it has come the whole Christian Science movement, the whole religious science movement, and various other lesser sects, all of whom are living and thriving, who believe that thoughts are things, who believe that you do healing through thinking. Well, this is interesting because there is a certain amount of healing that I know darn well you can do through thinking because I've seen it. But the interesting part of it is that this is where the change in that idea came from 100 years ago. And now as we go on, instead of relying on this thinking tool, we are relying on a shifting of energy levels, energy ideas, as a means of mental and physical healing. And by healing, I'm not talking really about fixing up a broken bone or remedying a stomachache. I'm talking about making a man a whole man. And you see, it was those metaphysicians really who first got the idea that there is a wholeness coming in somewhere, but they so precisely pinpointed their very rigid approach that it prevented them from getting further away and seeing it in a larger range. And it's only after 100 years that this now is beginning. You're now beginning to see these as outward and visible symbols of the progression of the ideas of energy. Now I'm going to get into tarot cards and astrology presently too. If Gus, what's his name, will do it down in Julie, I can do it up here. Anyway, so all of this, if you can get that floor of the pelvis, where that floor of the pelvis goes, you have an energy web underneath you, which then lets you come up. It not only lets you come up, it buoys you so that you are more comfortable up than you are down. And you see how you have developed this idea of the floor of the pelvis. You've first gone into it very primitively, so to speak. You have actually approached it in terms of the muscles which literally attach at the edges of the floor of the pelvis, which is logical. And this has been your fourth hour. And you've gone all around it. You've made your first step into the area by way of the adductors. All of the adductors. Because it is the adductors that are most intimately attached to the actual muscles which constitute the floor. And then you realize that by the time you get to the adductor magnus, you're not really in a true adductor in the sense that it attaches to the ischial tuberosity, and it is the immediate neighbor of the hamstrings. And its function is not that different from the hamstrings. And I'm not quite sure as to why it was named as an adductor, because it didn't have the simplicity of function that the adductors have. But at any rate, you're still going around the edges of the pelvis. You're still making it possible to shift the pelvis in terms of the resilience that you're giving their attachments. And so in that fourth hour, and let's settle this once and for all now, we are going to do the adductors. We are going to finish with the hamstrings. And by the time you've done all that, those patients of yours, those subjects of yours have had it. And you better bring them to a place of balance where you can terminate the hour appropriately with a pelvic lift and something to organize the neck, as you understand, and call it a day. Now, when you come back the next time, you still don't like what you see, because you're still seeing a pot belly, and you're still seeing a certain amount of pulled downness of the thorax. And an imbalance, I mean, it doesn't please you. And as you begin to try to find out what else you can do to please yourself better, to relate, and now you've got to start relating things to the pelvis rather than only freeing the pelvis. So you're now getting into a more complicated setup. You're now getting to the place where you have got to make a thorax think it belongs to that pelvis. If not, where are you? You're still not, but you still haven't got a whole man. Because it is the whole man with which you're thinking and dealing and working in this room. And so as you meditate about this, and you're as sharp-eyed as Bev over there, you see to it, well, there's something here that isn't right. And you go in and you use your head at this point and realize that you have to deal with the rectus. Now, the minute you begin getting into the rectus, you begin working your way into some other considerations. For one thing, that rectus is going to organize. It's going to pull the pelvis up in front. This is the most obvious thing. It's going to let the rib cage, the lower ribs, the sternum, etc., go up, lift. But you are now getting into a different level of operation in that body, because the rectus is the antagonist of the psoas. And this is a something which nobody seems to have, a fact which nobody seems to have ever put to work consistently. Now, the psoas is a relatively unique structure in the body. Listen to what I've said. I've said that the rectus is the antagonist of the psoas. And this seems to be a piece of just plain nonsense. When did you ever hear of an antagonist lying right next door to its agonist? And yet this is the way the thing works. As they cross the rim of the pelvis, pubes, the psoas is practically contiguous with the rectus. And I'm telling you, question mark, that these things are agonist and antagonist. Yes, I am, and you'll see it. Now, the psoas, as I've said, is unique in many respects. In the first place, it does have a motor function. But in the second place, it has a different quality about it than the average motor muscle. Because it is so intimately connected with the autonomic nervous system. Because the lumbar plexus is practically embedded on the surface of the psoas. And therefore, anything that exercises the psoas, that gives that pumping function which is exercise, which changes metabolism of an area, is going to affect the metabolism of the lumbar plexus. Now, the psoas is not very far from the solar plexus, but it's not as intimately connected as it is with the lumbar plexus. The psoas is not very far. Well, as you go down the line, the psoas gets further away because the psoas diagonally crosses the pelvis. And the autonomic centers are still lying right in front of the spine itself. The distance between the psoas and the spine becomes greater the lower you go. So, that psoas becomes very intimately connected with everything that is controlled through the lumbar plexus. This is particularly true of the whole bowel expiratory function. Now, look at the great American illness. How many dollars worth of anti-constipation remedies are sold annually, daily, what have you? How does it get that way? Why does it get that way? It gets that way because the psoas is literally thrown out, geared out. It's geared out because the rectus, you're looking for your daughter, but she'll get here.
I'm looking for my wife also. I didn't want her to leave until
Do you want somebody to stay at the gate?
No, they're coming in.
Oh, they are. You see?
I'll see them. I'll be bothered.
The rectus is the muscle that we train in all our orthodox physical training programs. All the push-ups, all the pull-ups, every last one of them is designed to shorten and to thicken and to do something funny with the rectus abdominis. And here you see you are disturbing the balance between agonist and antagonist. Because the more you shorten and thicken and make the rectus funny, the more you gear out the psoas and its function, letting it little and little completely deteriorate, so that you have no appropriate metabolic support for your nerve center there.
So push-ups are not good to do. If they shorten the rectus.
Look, Beverly, go back, sit back in the corner. By and by you'll get an answer. You won't be too dead. So, right here and right now, you begin to see from whence comes all the bay windows. From whence comes all the, and another irremediable cause of bay windows, of course, is the amount of surgery that has been done. Fortunately, this younger generation is no longer getting it. But my generation, you just didn't find these people without seeing a nice big scar across that abdomen, which now prevented and permanently prevented the falling back of the abdominal wall. And you see, all this gives you a picture of what begins to go wrong with the individual as he gets into the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and by the 60s it's really wrong with him. He's been fighting all the way along the line, and now he's lost the fight. But you see, what you're dealing with here is now the growing conception of your need to deal with the psoas. Your need to understand the psoas. Now there's another function of the psoas that you also need to put, quote, in its place. And that's the recognition of the fact that the psoas is the motor link, connecting link, between the legs and the diaphragm, the rib cage. So in other words, it's the thing that holds the top and the bottom together. Remember that the psoas attaches on the anterior aspect of the first, the second, the third lumbars. And the crura of the diaphragm lies immediately adjacent to it on the anterior surface of the first and the second lumbars. So along about the time that you get your psoas balled up, you've also got your diaphragm balled up. I remember in the old days when I was developing this, and I wasn't developing it from a developed philosophy, but from the actual practical experience. How amazed I used to be that many heart conditions didn't respond until you got into the 4th and 5th hour. When you got down there, I thought, to the attachment of the rectus. I didn't understand this. But now, what I say is that I wasn't dealing with the rectus at all. I was dealing with the psoas. And through the psoas with the diaphragm and the solar plexus. And the whole rhythm of the heart control there, coming through there.
Would you say that again?
I said that I thought that I had been dealing with the rectus abdominis, but that I had now concluded that I was really dealing with the psoas. Now maybe I wasn't, maybe I was dealing only indirectly with that psoas by virtue of the agonist-antagonist thing. But the fact of the matter remains that right down here is a control for the whole cardiovascular system. Not the control, a control. It may not be a control, but when it goes wrong, everything else goes wrong too. That's what I'm really trying to say. So that now you are getting into the 5th hour and you are dealing with the rectus abdominis, and realize that you cannot deal with the rectus abdominis except as you are also dealing with the psoas. These two things can't be separated. And if your psoas, through polio or some other situation, has been retired from service, so to speak, that rectus is taking on a burden which it cannot carry indefinitely. It, in its turn, is going to try to get help from here, there, and the other place. So that now you begin to see the significance of that 5th hour in which you are dealing with the rectus as a unit, and with the psoas as a unit if you can get back there. You can't always, and you can many times. Many times you can just get your fingers back and literally go scrape along the front edge of the lumbars. Literally, and in your scraping, it isn't that you scrape the psoas off, but that you scrape some energy into the deteriorated structure. But with people, particularly with the mesomorphic type, you have a lot of trouble getting back there. Endomorph you can get through. An ectomorph doesn't have anything to keep you out. And a mesomorph is not going to stand for it without a lot of fuss. So this is what you were doing yesterday, and this is what you're going to be doing today. You start up there around, by the way, Beverly, where does the rectus attach?
At the
Hey, look in your head.
xiphoid process, and also at
Not
the,
really.
Not at
The xiphoid is pretty independent, I think. Right.
I thought it connected at the.
Look in the
the
book.
I thought.
Book says it
said
does.
The book says it's really attached.
The book says that the xiphoid is one of the attachments. Yeah.
And it's the 4th, 5th, and 6th costal.
5th,
5th, 6th, and 7th.
yeah. Well, I don't, but it goes as high as the 5th rib.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you're going to start your work way up around the 5th rib. And it goes quite a way out on the 5th rib. And as you look at what you can't get, I mean, you get the feeling of how the 5th rib and on down should look. And then you look at the individual and you can't get it. And then you have to look as to why you can't get it. And sometimes this will carry you far afield. But what I complain about is when you just go afield, as Owen went afield yesterday on Fritz, and I said that isn't Fifth Hour way over under there. And yet maybe Owen was right. Maybe this was the place that literally held it. But the problem is that in a proper Fifth Hour, there's so much to be done that if you go gathering daisies right when you start, you're not going to get to the end of the road in the time allotted. So that you have to get considerable discrimination. And your goal, your immediate goal, is this business of getting elasticity into those two rectus muscles. Now, another one of the things that you have to bear in mind, this is a practical warning, and I bid you be warned. It is highly possible for you to pull those two rectus muscles apart. It has never happened to me or anybody I was working with, but in theory at least, if you just go after a single rectus muscle, or you go after it this way instead of this way, you are doing a very dangerous, hazardous business. So always bear this in mind, that however you are dealing with those rectus muscles, you always have a component which brings them together in your fingertips once they're off the rib cage. I know that you all know about umbilical hernias. As a matter of actual fact, in the case of an umbilical hernia, which has only relatively recently happened, you can get them to heal this way. Don't make any promises, but I've seen them. I've seen umbilical hernias the size of a silver dollar. I forgot, you people don't know what a silver dollar is. But I've seen this thing just close itself right up again if you bring the rectus in. And realize that this becomes a dangerous procedure unless every one of the eyes in those 8 fingers keeps looking to see how the strands of that rectus lie and keeps bringing them together. And you see, they belong together, and it is when they are together that you are able to induce the appropriate elasticity. Because you remember the first rule of Rolfing is you bring the structure toward the direction in which it should be before you start demanding movement of it. So that part of that 5th hour direction is that you bring those recti together. And then you have organized the top, the attachment from the 5th rib down. You've sort of pretty well cleared it up as it goes over the edge of the thorax. Don't get the feeling that it's not stuck on that rib, so that the rib in respiration is dragging on it. And then sometimes it pays better to just sort of hop, skip, and jump down to the other end. And sometimes it doesn't. And this is something you have to sort of get a feeling for. At any rate, you're going to have to do the 2 ends and the middle. And when you go down to the other end, hear that voice of the top dog talking to you, as Hector would say, reminding you to visualize the relationship at the other end between rectus and psoas. Let your fingers tell you. Let your fingers talk to you. Now, the funny part of it is that you will find pubic pubes in the strangest places. They may be almost literally projecting outside the abdominal wall, and they may be so deep in that it's all you can do, searching with your fingers to find them. And you say, my God, the guy's lost his pubes. And it may take you considerable search to find it. And either of those situations, when you have cleared the psoas and the rectus, either one will come to a midpoint, to a balance at a midline where you find it easily with your fingers, and it talks to you, and it's clean, and your fingers can differentiate between rectus attachment and psoas transmission. Sometimes you'll find that the pubes seem to be, that the whole pubic structure just dives down on one side. You can't find it on one side, and it's a perfectly normal position on the other side. The guy has trouble with his walking, and he doesn't know why. He has pain in one hip, and he doesn't know why, etc., etc. And all of these things your fingers are going to learn about. But always remember, as I say, the voice of the top dog says, you should get those things up where they are balanced and where you recognize that the bone, the pelvic bone, belongs if you're going to get your horizontal pelvis, because you're still gunning for a horizontal pelvis. And the discussion this morning has only added to your understanding of why you want the pelvis horizontal. Now this constitutes the fifth hour. Do not forget that in that fifth hour, you also have a minor goal of organizing the legs to the proper width. Many, many times those legs are too close together. Many, many times those legs are too far apart. But in that fifth hour, you see, as you go down in that general groin area, it's your job to get the length of the connections that hold the leg into the pelvis wide enough that the leg can sit out where it belongs, or narrow enough that it brings it in where it belongs. This is part of the fifth hour work. The organization of the whole groin structure belongs, and of the groin structure as a whole, belongs properly in the fifth hour. And you see, now you are beginning to really get to a place where a lot of the work on that pelvis is done. And you will then be ready to go along into a sixth hour.
To be continued.
To be continued.
Tune in tomorrow for the next exciting chapter.
The next exciting chapter. Shall we have coffee? Shall we get to work? What shall we do?
I do see an awful lot of people with rectus muscles that are quite far lateral.
Oh,
I think
yes.
that's a common thing to...
Oh, yes, but bring them in. They'll always come in. They'll always come in. Everything in the body tends to move laterally. And having gotten stuck lateral, they have to keep going around and around and around and around and around. So one of the most difficult problems with the rectus muscle nowadays is the surgical scars. And as I say, it's nothing like as difficult as it was 20 years ago, because there was so much more invasion of body through surgery than there is now.
There's a lot more transverse incisions than there used to be.
Yeah, but even these vertical incisions, the scar tissue really messes things up in a big, big way.
Well, surgeons used to think that the best way to incise an abdomen was to open parallel to the muscle fibers. But actually, opening perpendicular to the muscle fibers is much more effective.
Well, I do know that I just don't have as much trouble nowadays as I used to have. And of course, in the old days, there was a period, again, about 25, 30 years ago, when every time a woman got into any consistent menstrual problem, some surgeon thought it would be a very good idea to take the uterus out. And then, you see, you had the whole area of the uterus and adnexa had to be filled in with connective tissue. One woman came to me and reported that she had been to a gynecologist, and he had said that the next time she got into trouble like this, he was going to take the uterus out, because the uterus seemed to be a poison in a woman anyway.
That's what he said.
Well, that's not an unusual viewpoint.
That's just a case of
Yeah, but they shouldn't have knives in their hands when they have that viewpoint. As Don says, an MD is just fine so long as you don't put him in a white coat. As window washers and what else was it? Plumbers.
Plumbers, carpenters.
The first, no, he really wasn't the first man. He was the first scientifically inclined man to look at the fact that body structure and body behavior had a relation.
Before all of these guys was William James, too.
Reich's view was not the view of the man as a whole. Reich's view was the view of the man as a pelvis.
Yes.
And the man may be basically a pelvis, but he's more than that. Alexander saw the light, perhaps more than any of the rest of them, A.M. Alexander. But you see, Alexander was not a scientifically trained individual. He was an actor. He was a neurotic down to the core. He didn't want to convey what he saw. He wanted to keep himself, in my opinion, this is what I see in his books. He wanted to keep himself up on his own little pedestal as he knew, and of course you couldn't know because you weren't as bright as he. The history of Alexander is very, very interesting. Do all of you know it?
No.
Well, Alexander was an Australian actor, and he went to London, and somewhere in the middle of his London acting, he lost his voice. Now he was an actor not only without a job, but without a voice to get a job. And this went on for a year and a half, 2 years. And finally, his voice returned. And as he was in good voice there, he thought, and he got his job, and he went back to the stage. And lo and behold, in the middle of the performance, he had no voice. Now, anybody else, with all those psychoanalysts around them, would have known that he just didn't want to sing, and that therefore he lost his voice. But Alexander wasn't bright enough to know that, so he started looking for a different premise. And Alexander went back to his room, and he decided that he was doing something on the stage which cut off his voice. And so he started doing his, practicing his songs, or speeches, or whatever it was, before the mirror in his bedroom. And he saw, you see, that he was doing this, and that somehow this cut off his voice. And from there on, he started thinking about how do you get your head on top of your neck and your neck on top of your shoulders, but particularly your head. And he worked through the only medium that he knew, which was a voluntary direction to do something, and then to do it. In other words, this was a mind-body technique which he now developed. Technically speaking, it was a self-hypnosis technique sort of thing. It was a suggestion sort of thing. Top of the head straight up, back of the head straight back. And you do it often enough, and various things happen. You see, Alexander and Reich had now done the two ends of the line, and nobody put them together in the middle. And Feldenkrais, this was in the early years of the war. It was in 42, 43, something like that. Maybe 41, 42. Feldenkrais was a well-trained physicist, but a well-trained physicist. He'd worked with the Curie group, and in fact, in one of the basement rooms of the University of Paris at this day, there is a bronze plaque that says that Curie and what was the name of his son-in-law. And Moshe M. Feldenkrais worked in this room on the problem of so-and-so. So Feldenkrais was a man who'd done a lot of thinking in terms of physics. And why and how this guy, who was born a Russian, a Ukrainian Jew, and who later became a citizen of Israel, how he happened to be in England and subject to English service requirements, I don't know. But at any rate, he was stationed up in Scapa Flow in some of the radio installations up there, something of this sort. And here he was, stuck away in Scapa Flow, and there wasn't a physicist within 1,000 miles. And he was pretty lonely, and he couldn't think what to do with his evenings. So he sat down and he started in thinking about structure and personality. He had already had a lot of Freudian analysis. And he was thinking in terms of Freudian analysis. And you see, he went somewhat of the route of Reich, in the sense that Reich, I think, was probably the first one who realized that if you were going to get Freudian results, you had to have a mechanics through which you got them. And Reich set out to try to find that mechanics, and within limits Reich did. But Feldenkrais went further than this, and again, he was not limiting his view of the man to the pelvis, as all these psychoanalysts were doing. He was putting the man together as a whole, and he was calling attention to the fact that the man as a whole, in terms of his posture, which is behavior, betrayed other levels of behavior, psychological, the immaturity or immaturity of behavior. And so Feldenkrais, sitting up there in Scapa Flow, wrote that manuscript. And when he got some time off, he went down and he got an appointment with F.M. Alexander. And he called on Alexander, and Alexander was pretty cool to him, and he left his manuscript there and asked him to read it. He would call for it the day after tomorrow or what have you. And when he got back, F.M. Alexander just about literally, now I'm telling you this firsthand, Feldenkrais himself told me this, he just about literally kicked the guy down the brownstone steps and the manuscript after him. And why he did this, I don't quite know, except that he probably recognized the fact that this was a very dangerous competitor. And that was the end of Feldenkrais and Alexander. And Feldenkrais kept his cool about it, but Alexander obviously didn't. But then Alexander wasn't cool about anything or anybody. Alexander was a man who saw to it that he didn't get along with anybody. And the people that surrounded him were his own family, who couldn't escape from him. And the only one in the world that could influence him at all was a certain niece of his, who then saw to it that she lived with him, keeping track of Uncle and seeing to it that Uncle ate on time, things like that. And she married a young doctor, and this young doctor also went in for the Alexander thinking and work. And he is no longer a young doctor now. I'd say he's in the 65s or so. But at any rate, he has the Alexander technique, or he did have when I used to play in England, set up in one of the hospitals with reasonably good documentation. He has a lot of photographs and so forth showing what the Alexander technique has done. And the Alexander technique still has a fairly good reputation in England. And then within the Alexander School, there were 2 or 3 other very gifted, relatively gifted teachers that stood out above the rest of the gang. And presently they broke off, because you see, with this kind of personality at the head of the thing couldn't hold itself together. And I forget the name of the man that made the biggest dent in it. I think he's dead now too. At any rate, he had as a patient the man who was the treasurer of England, the Lord of the Treasury in England during the war years. He was a socialist, Sir Stafford Cripps. And Sir Stafford Cripps was very much impressed with what had been done for him. He wasn't a particularly rich man, but he saw to it that this splintered group got itself pretty well established in England. And Lady Cripps, after Sir Stafford's death, Sir Stafford was a man who was I think he literally died as a result of a gastric ulcer. Anyway, he had a frightful gastric ulcer all during those years when he gave his services to the Treasury, the Lord of the Exchequer in England. And how the guy carried on, I don't know. Apparently, he thought he carried on by virtue of this Alexander technique. And Lady Cripps supported this group. I don't mean exclusively, but she gave her moral support and the support of her altitude and so forth to this particular splinter group rather than to the main Alexander group. So that this became one of the principal factors in the Alexander work in England. I knew Lady Cripps. In fact, I treated her once or twice. And she left me to go to Africa to visit a daughter of hers who was married to one of the politicians down in Kenya or something. So, at any rate, that's the story of Alexander. Except he was an exotic guy. He never had any money in his pocket, and when he happened to get some money in his pocket, he would go to the racetrack, and invariably he would succeed in losing all the money he had. And he would practically have to walk home, ups and downs, and so forth and so forth. And this would go on over and over and over again. He never learned, but he was an interesting figure. And he had one brother who apparently was not as interesting a figure, but a man who was more by attitude more suitable for the work. And this brother, I don't remember what his name was. At any rate, this brother did a lot of spreading of the true Alexander gospel, and this brother came to North America and did a lot of work along the East Coast, particularly in Boston, and from there he went up into Montreal. And as a result of the work of that brother, there is at this point still quite a going group of Alexander teachers in this country. They don't make as much noise as perhaps they're entitled to make. But you see, the Alexander work is a work, basically a suggestion work. And suggestion does work. But after it works, you've got to keep on suggesting. And this is the reason why what you are doing is not a competitor of the Alexander method. What you are doing would not be as precise if I had never heard of the ideas of Alexander. He contributed a great deal to my thinking. He was the first man, perhaps the only man, before this school of work, right here in this room, that ever gave real consideration to where a head belonged with relation to a body. There have been no others, really. There have been people who thought of where top vertebra belongs, the atlas, the axis. But there's been nobody that has related the weight of the head to the structure of the supports. And so you see, you people owe a debt to Alexander, and you'd better know it, because this question will come up over and over again. Oh, have you ever heard of the work of F.M. Alexander?
Yes.
And you better say yes.
Dr. Rolf, there's a new book, The Resurrection of the Body.
I have heard of it.
And it has a footnote that gives some insight into what he does other than the head.
I would like to see the book.
Yeah,
I'll see to it when I get it.
I don't have it.
I'll see.
I read it. And
I have heard of it, and I've been intending to do something about it for a long time.
Who's the author group?
It's a collection of F.M. Alexander's.
Yeah.
And but Alexander himself didn't want to communicate. And if you read his books, this is perfectly obvious.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Alexander had some of the same problem that we have right here. He was trying to communicate as something that nobody had thought about before. And he wasn't that much of an intellectual that he knew how to deal with the problem of words. And so he talked around and around and around and around. And as far as I'm concerned, reading those books of Alexander's is an absolute punishment. But you try it. Maybe you like to be punished. Because he doesn't get to the point, he doesn't say what he really means. And what he did in his books was simply to build up his own reputation. And this was all right, too. Alexander had a schedule book that read like the Almanac to Gotha. Everybody in the top drawer in England went to Alexander's or to this other guy's that was Scripps support. And this is the story of Alexander. Now, it behooves you to think of this and to recognize the fact that this other end of the body that you are going to be dealing with next week is a different, it's a related problem, but it's a problem that warrants as much thought as your pelvic end. And you have to relate it into that whole pelvic problem. Now, this is what Alexander didn't do. He thought about the head. He was interested in the head. He was interested in the throat because he was basically an actor, and by temperament. I mean, everything I've been talking about is this temperament of a very gifted actor. But he didn't recognize the fact that until you set that head on top of a well-defined, secure structure, you didn't have something that was going to stay with you. Now, Alexander had a pair of very gifted students, had a lot of very gifted students. But there was a Mr. and a Mrs. Gerald Lee, who came at various times from Northampton, Massachusetts, and New York City, who were among his most gifted disciples. I say that because they had further insights. And because they had further insights, Alexander really threw them out. Gerald Lee was a little bit of a guy, and Mrs. Lee was a little bit of a gal. In fact, Mrs. Lee was more like a hummingbird than any woman I've ever known. She had been a teacher of creative writing in Smith College for endless years, 50 probably, before she died. Get some sort of Xerox that we can look at to get greater reality on this. Because what you see in these books is not that good.
You know what you could do with these, all these good photographers here? Just make a set of 35mm slides. Right out of these books.
Yes, you can, but somebody first has to get the whole list of on page so-and-so of Spalterholz, we want
Yeah,
that.
well, let's do that.
Well, we've tried it.
We can take close-up, makes 35 slides, maybe?
We have started this at least 6 times, Mac, and never has it lasted beyond 2 hours of work on anybody's part. You see, it needs consistent, thoughtful selection.
You willing to do it, though?
I'll take the photographs and someone will find the material.
Sure. I'll tell you what to take if they'll take the photographs. It's just tonight. Can you take close-ups? Fine. Kodachrome?
Well, I'll probably take it 52, 54, and that way we can get several sets.
Take what? Yeah,
Take it with negative.
You take it with a negative and preserve the negative. So
Right, and then when I get it developed, I can get, say, 5
right,
sets.
right, right. But hang on for
And
negative.
then when you wanted to do this, you could just flash it on the screen or something. Yeah, sure, because it's easier.
Well, sometimes it is. And you see, if we were flashing on the screen, it means a lot of setup here, right now. Whereas, actually, there's no law that says you can't do both.
Yes, it's just
There's no law. All of this we have been talking about for 2 years. And as I say, various people have been assigned the job of, as we went through these books, I would say, now on such and such a book, on such and such a page, we want this photograph. And where are those lists now?
All right.
Now, if we can do better than that in this class, and we may well,
We'll stay in the here and now.
let's stay in the here and now. Okay. Now, I don't know a thing about this. All I know is what I read in the paper. But I do know that there is an old yoga technique which includes the use of rectal dilators to control many symptoms, to control headaches, particularly kind of headache you get after a day of shopping, etc., etc., to control spasm of the digestive system to control heart rate and breath rate by putting a rectal dilator into that anus. And there is no other explanation for what happens, except that you are changing the position and perhaps putting pressure on that ganglion of impar. And that suddenly you don't have a headache anymore. Now, obviously, if you add that ganglion of impar and that coccyx to a place where they just automatically take their place in life and change with the changing demand made on them, you don't need rectal dilators. Also, obviously, if you get a coccyx as unhappy, chronically unhappy, as Don's was yesterday, maybe even a rectal dilator is not going to do that particular job. And maybe you have a degree of strain, continuous chronic strain on the nervous system, which is not showing up as he goes to a doctor for a checkup on his blood pressure, etc., 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 etc. But my point is, we are dealing with the coarser material of the fascial body. It is not our business to even give serious consideration to dealing with nervous plexi. This is getting into something that's for the big boys. We're not that big. We just deal with fascia. We just deal with that, what they can't do. Oh, it's too trite. But this is what happens. And you see, if you get this as a consideration in the back of your mind, again, you start changing your whole, this kind of consideration, to the rotators. And we try to get those 5 rotators all coming along, getting themselves on a level where they can work together, live together, and act as a group, which in most instances they can't. Some 1 or some 2 of those things will be deteriorated, and they drag everything with them. And the rotators are of this degree of importance because they are the only group, and there's only one member of that group really that fits in what I'm saying, 2 members maybe. They are the only structures in the body where you can put your finger on the outside and the other end of your finger, so to speak, goes onto the basic inside, the lining of the sacrum. There's no other muscle that you can get hold of in these hot little hands where you can do this. And so, therefore, the lowest part of that spinal structure, a basic part of the pelvic structure, you can directly influence through those rotators. And this is literally a gift of God, pure velvet. You had no business to expect it. But you can do it, and in doing it, you see, you organize the sacrum and necessarily the coccyx, because whatever you do to the sacrum is going to be reflected into the coccyx. Whatever you do to the coccyx is going to be reflected into the sacrum. Now, you do not get a hold of a coccyx and drag it around. You stretch the fascial planes, fascial materials that determine the position of that coccyx. It's the same old story. You do not get a hold of a bone and by force do something with it.
I have a question. question at this point. Do you ever work around the coccyx before you work on the rotators? Yesterday, Don's coccyx got much worse after we worked on the rotators because I think the sacrum came back and the coccyx dove more.
Oh, ever is a long time. And I realize that when I pontificate about you always do so-and-so, that the half an hour after I'm looking at myself and saying, I thought I heard you say you never do this.
You know, with fascia, and you said by stretching a bone or stretching a coccyx, it does not increase the length. And this is, by fascial tissue, is very definite, is that it will grow in the lines of stress and become stronger in the lines of stress. If you pull on the bone, it will orient itself towards the lines of stress and become tighter and stronger in that direction.
Yeah. But I don't know, it's part of the whole concept of this particular bit that we're threading out here, that we deal with soft tissue, not with bone. The bone deals with itself.
I wasn't referring specifically that your comment of pulling on the coccyx. It would be increasing the tightness of the fascia by orienting the cells or fibers in that direction. And this is what happens to any fascial tissue, is it orients in the direction of stress.
Yeah, there's no question about it, very little question about that. But have I answered your question?
I think so, yeah. I was just thinking that it seems to me there could be times that you might want to
There are plenty of
grab the
times.
coccyx or around the coccyx before you went to the rotator.
All right. This doesn't make me mad that you should think that. It's one of the knife edges that I've never been able to really cross consciously. I walk across these, you know, I hop, skip, and jump across these, and somehow I get across, but I never really know how. This whole business of getting a precision approach that always works. I don't believe there is a precision approach that always works. But in order for you people to learn from zero, you have to learn on the assumption that there is a precision approach. And as you get much more experienced, you learn that you change the approach. But the problem comes when you have done 2 hours of work and your ego says, oh, well, after all, I know more than she does. Let me try it this way. And then you try it that way 6 times and you've forgotten that she said you go this way. And so you've forgotten the path that'll lead you and you keep going down another path. And you don't get the result. And as I say, I find that at knife edge, which is very hard for me to negotiate. I will guarantee you that if you follow the recipe, you'll get the result. The cake will come out all right. But that you always have to do only that recipe. This is not factual. Only I recommend that you stay with the recipe. Period. For a long time to come. For a year, 2 years. And then if you want to play around, all right. But if you play around early, you just lose your vision that comes through the repetitive performance of a certain pattern.
Peter was just talking to me about that. Peter Knocker, he said that he's followed the recipe consistently for 2 years and just now he's beginning to move on to the repetitive. We can see where he can move.
That's right. And this is one of the things that made Peter such an outstandingly good performer. He has been willing to sit back and see what he can do with that recipe. And very rapidly, the intuition is getting into his hands and he'll be hearing about it. But you see that even I, every so and so often, get real smart. And somebody comes in and they so obviously have some strain that's right at that point. And I know I can do it. I'm going to show off this time. And I go in there. But 3 hours later, I look at the guy and something hasn't been done. And it hasn't been done because I haven't followed the recipe. I was talking to Rosemary on the phone last night. I wonder whether Lee remembers that she should phone her.
I've already done.
Oh, good. And Rosemary was saying, I'm going to start on my 10th hours tomorrow and I'm going to meet all my karma. And I said, yeah, you bet you are. And this is a statement of fact of the matter. She is going to meet every doggone thing that she has forgotten to do before she can get that 10th hour organized. And it's much simpler to follow the recipe. Because then you know that you haven't really skipped something. You may have overlooked it by virtue of an improper seeing, but you haven't really skipped it, Lily. It'll be there. It'll be available. Okay, let's do something or other. 20 after 10. How is it? What kind of an internal clock is this?